Okay, we're back for part 3 of the deployment mini-series.
Okay, so this one ties in a lot with our previous one.
Oh, scout deployment. Okay.
Yes, so we're doing scout instead of infiltrate. And there are a couple of things that these two definitely influence each other, but it's can be very interesting as far as understanding the difference between them. So scout, obviously, you deploy in your deployment zone, and before the game, you get to make a move, effectively getting into the neutral zone before the game actually starts, which means during your first turn, assuming you go first, you would then get to basically double move because you scouted up. You get to pull your cards, gain your command points, and then you get to move again in your actual movement phase. Obviously, there's different types of scouting units, whether it's screening units or aggressive like melee units, like in World Eaters, things like that. But one of the biggest differences is when you start, obviously you want to ask your opponent, do you have infiltrators? Because that will help determine where you're going to put your scouts. But the question for you when it comes to placing them with infiltrators, we talked about is when. If they have infiltrators, when do you deploy them? Because you want to influence that. Well, if you have scouts and they have infiltrators, you can't really influence that much. So you have a much bigger question of where do you deploy them? Infiltrators, if you can answer the when, that fixes most of your where problems. With scouts, if you can answer the where question, it fixes your when problem. When you are going to deploy your scouts, you want to make sure that they don't get move blocked by buildings or vehicles in your army, things like that. Because if you put your scouts too far back, they don't actually get to scout anywhere because there's too much stuff in the way. They can't walk through buildings, depending on the type, or maybe there's this vehicle in the way because you decided to put this big tank up front, and now you can't get anywhere, so you've effectively stopped your own scouting.
Right.
Also, obviously, if your opponent has infiltrators, you can't scout within range of those guys, so they may limit your movement. But if you know, scouts tend to be much more versatile as far as like screening and blocking, because if you deploy, let's say, in between or like inside this building and you're going to walk through and screen, well, once you walk through, you could go left or right. Your opponent doesn't actually know which side they need to stop you from going on, even after you've placed them. So again, if you can figure out the where problem, by the time that you're like, okay, my scouts could go here and it'd be okay, or here and it'd be okay, I'm not sure which, maybe I'll hold off on placing them, because there's no pressure as to when to place them, as long as you know that they could go in these two spots, so you leave open space for them. Or let's say they don't have infiltrators. Well, now I want to deploy them where they can scout properly and do their job, but also I could totally throw them out early, because I'm giving my opponent very little information, in that when I scout, I could go left or right or straight forward, and they have no idea. Like, they have a general idea of where I'm going, but they don't really know for sure. I could totally go sideways and start going after this objective, or I could, go straight forward and try to like tie up their tank with these cultists. I'm not going to do anything, but I could just tie them up, and maybe that's enough.
Yeah.
And then obviously, same with infiltrators. Try to determine their job. That will help you determine where to place them. If their job is screening, I've had many discussions on like Catagen jungle fighters that have scout. If you put them inside a Chimera, the Chimera gets scout. And well, that's great, but if their job is to turn one, scout, screen, and die, that's totally fine. But putting them in a Chimera, how much more benefit does that get you? Because if you go second, the Chimera scouts forward, it's screening less than the Catagens could if they were outside of the Chimera. And now they've already like run past the Chimera, or they charge the Chimera, crack that, and the scouts are still there, but the Catagens were still there, but they were meant to die anyway. So even if the scouts are still alive and the Chimera's dead, was it worth it? Like, because you're doubling the number of points or more in order to put them in that vehicle. There are times where the answer is yes. It's totally reasonable to put Catagens inside a Chimera. But there are other times where that is not always like the best answer. And a lot of people just, see lists on the internet and things like that, and they're just like, oh yeah, that's the trick. You do the thing, and now your Chimera scouts forward, and then you could disembark and screen better on turn 1. But again, that's all assuming you go first. So it's just a thing to think about. With the aggression side of things, again, aggression could be based on durability, and I want to scout so I can get on the objective turn 1, and I'm so durable, I'll spend a command point to give them like armor contempt or something like that, and just, I'm going to live on that objective, and that sounds good. There are other times where it's aggression. I want to scout, because if I can scout, I could advance and charge in turn 1, maybe I could charge, and if I can make that charge, removing almost anything, like I've hemmed them in their deployment zone, and that's pretty solid.
Oh, yes.
So,
I've actually done that with Super Grots on multiple occasions.
Yep. And that's where it gets to, depending on, if the Grot's job is to screen, or if the Grot's job is to, tie something up on turn 1. That kind of depends on your opponent's list, right? Whether to run a bunch of tanks, or, if you were to charge Super Grots into, a full brick of, boys or something like that, is it really even worth it? Because on the clap back, you lose most, if not all, of the unit on your turn 1 charge.
So in the game with Drew, I scouted, and then it was a WA turn, so they declared WA turn 1. Mm-hmm. Then they moved 12, and they could advance and charge, but I think they advanced like 6 inches, or like, because I rolled a 6.
Sure.
And they were 1 inch away from Custodes Wardens. Now they're scary, no doubt, but the Grots pinned him into his deployment zone for 2 turns because they're -1 to wound. They're absolute garbage, but they have enough bodies that they can stand there and be annoying.
Yeah,
and that stopped them from scoring primary for like a turn, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's great, right? It's like, yes, it's aggressive, but that's not necessarily what I mean by aggression. But that's like a solid screening unit.
Well, what's good is
you're hemming them into their deployment zone, and you're winning effectively by preventing your opponent from scoring. That's not scoring yourself, but it is like scoring by the end of the game.
The only reason I say they're a standout unit relevant to this is because if I go second, because there's 23 bodies and they were cheap, they're a good just screening unit, even if they just stand there in a line. If I end up going first, they can still push my opponent into their own deployment zone, so when they do take their turn, they have to do something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. But and that's really good use of scout. I would argue there's very little scout being used at the moment, because like I said, you've got like Catagens and you've got Grots, and that's fair. But overall, most people are using infiltrators over scouts.
Oh, yeah.
But as much as that's true, again, scouts are very versatile compared to infiltrators, and they're very good because you can change your tactics by making your like cool scout move or whatever after you've gained some more information. Infiltrators, again, you got to like deploy them early or deploy them late, and it's like how much of my opponent has deployed when I have to put them down or should put them down. I don't have as much information. Whereas like scouts, I could deploy them first, and because they're very flexible with could go left or right, if I put them in a reasonable position, I don't have to make any real like game defining decisions until after we're both fully deployed. Yeah. And I can see, it'd be better to go left.
Okay, I have a fun question before we're done. Are there any redeploys that you can pull off before making the scout moves, or do those all happen later?
No, so that changed in the new mission deck, Nexus. They changed the order in which certain things happen. So now all redeploys must happen before scout moves, required to.
Interesting. Okay, so like if you get move blocked by infiltrators, so you can't make your scout move because they're in the way, you'll get within 9, which you're not allowed to.
Yep.
You can then redeploy that scout unit to a different part of your deployment zone, to where, like, let's say now you can make your scout move because you're not move blocked anymore.
Yep. And this is why if you stack rules like redeploy and scout, it makes it to where they're very forgiving. So you deploy your scouts as like the very first deployment, and your opponent says, haha, you messed up. I'm going to put my infiltrators in front, and you don't get to scout. Well, now, again, it's so forgiving that you're like, well, I'm going to make sure that I leave a space to redeploy them later. I'm going to keep deploying, redeploy them over to the other side, then scout, and I've effectively received like no penalty. Maybe I've even tricked my opponent to putting the infiltrators on the wrong side because they felt the need to deploy those infiltrators early.
Yeah. Okay.
The same thing goes for the opposite side too. If you have, if your opponent has scout and you have infiltrate, but you have infiltrate and redeploy, because I've done this, well, now I have to make a hard decision of, do I redeploy my infiltrators because I'm like wanted to redeploy them, or do I leave them up there because they're stopping the scout?
Yeah. Food for thought. I'm hungry.